Lauren, is that working?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, cool. So if people can introduce themselves in the chat, that is great. Some people are putting in the Q&A because we were having chat drama. That's cool too. Um, oh, they say they still can't see it. All right, hold on, everyone. We're going to figure it out. We will start in a minute. Mhm.
Can folks try now? I tried to turn it off and back on, but
Okay. I'm guessing people still can't see it. So this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna get started because we're at 4 past the hour. People can use the Q&A for now. And Allie, if you can try to work on getting that set up, but if it's not working, we'll use the Q&A and we'll see what happens and we'll roll with it. Cool. All right, awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I bet some people are going to help us troubleshoot it in the Q&A also, which is helpful. But yeah, if you want to use the Q&A for now and say your name, what org you're from, where you live, and one corporation or billionaire you want to research, you can put that in there so we can get a little bit of a sense of who is on. And welcome to our first 2025 Research Tools for Organizers training. My name is Molly Gott, and I run our Research Tools for Organizers program at LittleSis. I'll say a little bit more about what LittleSis is in a second. And me, along with Lauren Parker, who's one of our research analysts, will be running tonight's training. A couple of things, kind of housekeeping things as we're getting started here. We're hopefully going to get the chat up and running. If it doesn't, that's cool. Use the Q&A. You can also put questions in the Q&A. And Allie, who is helping with tech on the back end, will help us kind of answer those questions as they come up if she can answer them. And we'll also pause a couple of times in tonight's training so that Lauren and I can answer any questions that are coming up. And I think people were already asking this, but there will be a recording tonight. This is being recorded now. It'll be shared to everyone who signed up for tonight, as well as on our YouTube page, which I'll share the information for, and all of our social media. So don't worry too much about taking notes or anything. We'll share that, and then we'll also share the slide deck so you can have that as well. So like I said, this is our first training in our series, Research Tools for Organizers this year. It's our intro training on Intro to Power Research. So tonight it's going to be a little bit more kind of like talking about concepts in organizing and in power research, and a little bit of power research history and kind of working through an example of how research and organizing and movement building can work together. The next 3 sessions after tonight are going to be much more in the weeds around particular research tools. So this is kind of like our orienting session that will hopefully kind of help you all start thinking about how you could integrate power research into your work. And then the next 3 will be kind of much more tools focused. I think probably a lot of people who are on tonight are familiar with LittleSis. Some people might not be. So just so people kind of know who we are and why we're putting this on, we're called LittleSis. We're called LittleSis because we're little sister, like the opposite of Big Brother. So instead of Big Brother looking down on people, we're people that are looking up at powerful corporations, elected officials, billionaires, and CEO, and mapping the relationships between them. So as part of that work, we do several things. One is that we do research, watchdog research, like I was just describing, that maps relationships between powerful industries, people, organizations, universities, corporate front groups, trade groups, political spending organizations. We'll get into more of that later. We also train organizations and activists and organizers on the ins and outs of how to do that research in an effort to kind of build up research capacity within our movements and research that's really interested in building social movements and winning campaigns. And then the third thing we do is oversee tech. So we have a database that is called LittleSis.org. It's a free open source platform that tracks relationships between powerful people and corporations. Um, it's like almost like a Facebook type thing, but for powerful people. And as part of that, we also have a mapping tool called Holographer that creates very nice, some of which you'll see later tonight, kind of visual maps of those power relationships. So that's a little bit about us, and kind of as part of our commitment to really building research skills broader than just in LittleSis, but throughout our organizations and throughout our movements. We're doing this training tonight and the rest that are in this series. So I think you all probably know because you're here, but these are free. They're monthly this summer. The next one is going to be June 18th. It's going to focus on the corporation. And then we're doing one on July 17th about nonprofits. And then our last one will be in August on the 14th about billionaires. You can sign up for the other sessions at this site down here, bit.ly/RTFO 2025. And they'll all be recorded. They'll all build on one another. And you can kind of do the whole series, or if there are particular ones that subject matter you think really fit into your work and organizing that you're doing, you can kind of like dip in and out as well. And so we'll hope to see you all on that. To get a little bit of a sense for us of who is in the room, we're going to do a poll. You know, these trainings are kind of like very broadly go out, come one, come all. We're glad you're all here. And also it's helpful for us to know a little bit more who's on. So I'm going to ask Allie, hopefully this works, to launch the first poll. And if people could just take a couple seconds, and answer these questions, that would be lovely. The first one is just asking, is it your first LittleSis training or have you been to another one? Second is just asking you to describe kind of yourself and your role in movement work. The third is what issues or movements you work on or are a part of. And then the last one is just asking kind of how familiar you are with power research. We'll ask you at the end again so we can have a sense of kind of if what we covered tonight was on track. So I'll give people a couple more minutes to answer. So I got a couple more people answering. Thank you guys so much. We'll do another 40 seconds. Couple more people. Okay, cool. I think we're gonna call it at 2 minutes. Allie, if you can end the poll. Thanks, y'all. That'll really help us figure out who's on here. So a little bit about how we're going to spend tonight. I'm just going to talk really quickly to kind of ground us in the political moment that we're all facing and living through. We're going to spend some time kind of going through examples of power research in movement history and up through today, with the hope that it'll kind of inspire people to think about how this kind of research can work locally where you're organizing. We're going to do a little something about just kind of like definitionally what power research is so that we're all kind of starting on the same um, kind of terrain together. And then we're going to do a little bit of a activity um, that will kind of put you in the shoes of a local campaign and kind of brainstorm how to make a research plan and start pulling together sources to answer questions you have. So we're gonna go about an hour and a half tonight. We might finish a little bit early, but that's the kind of basic plan. So I think we kind of wanted to talk briefly about kind of the political moment that we're in, that I know, we're all living through, that people on this call are working really deeply in, and just kind of say a couple words about that to kind of orient why we think it's important to be doing power research in this moment as part of broader movements. I think that there's also a lot of uncertainty in this moment, so it's a little bit hard to speak to it sometimes. But I think from our perspective at LittleSis, we're living in the midst of an increasingly fascist presidential administration that is really deeply aligned with corporate and billionaire power, particularly billionaire power in the tech, oil and gas, and Wall Street industries. And we're seeing increasing attacks on people of color, on immigrants, on student protesters, on trans people, alongside rapid dismantling of really crucial government protections and legal protections. And so, in the face of that, it's incredibly important to not let fear kind of immobilize us, but really to kind of deepen our commitment to one another, and to continuing to build mass movements of organized people that can resist the violence and exploitation that we are experiencing right now, and really organize to build a society that meets our needs and that we all deserve. And we know that many of you, if not all of you on this call, are doing that work in different ways, and that it looks different in different places with different strategies, different tactics, different theories that you're advancing. And so we see research and the kind of research that LittleSis does as one part of developing more strategic and effective campaigns and strategies to do just that. And so we're hoping that tonight we can share a little bit about how we can think about that all together. This kind of research is really flexible and depends on your local context, on the work that you're doing, but hopefully we'll provide some kind of solid examples, and then going forward in this series, some tools that you can bring back to where you're organizing, to your communities, that will be helpful. And we're always here as LittleSis, like we consider ourselves to be very deeply in partnership with social movement organizations. So we're always here to help support and kind of build out this work wherever you are. And with that, I think we want to kind of go back a little bit and think about and learn from kind of movements throughout history that have used power research and strategic research in different ways to kind of start sparking people's thinking about what this could look like. So we're going to talk about 3 examples tonight. One is from the post-war civil rights movement involving SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. One is from the anti-war movement. We're going to talk about a group called NARMIC, or National Action / Research on the Military Industrial Complex. And then we're going to talk about a more contemporary example of a campaign right now from several Palestine solidarity organizations called Genocide Gentry. So I'm just going to walk through these for the next few minutes and kind of share a little bit. One of our great LittleSis colleagues, Derek Seidman, who's also a historian, has spent some time kind of putting together these examples of research in movement building. And I think they're really instructive. And I think one of the things that we heard from folks last year from these trainings was that all of the tools were really helpful, but they needed a little bit more support in thinking like what it actually looks like to use the research and how it can be kind of embedded with organizing and base building, and kind of like campaign strategy development. So this is kind of one piece of us trying to kind of speak to that, is to kind of take us into history, and in a way that maybe is an easier context or a less fraught context now for us to think about and kind of reflect on together. So the first example that we wanted to talk about tonight was from the civil rights movement, SNCC, like I just said. I think a lot of people on this call are probably familiar with SNCC, maybe have read books about SNCC, know people who are in SNCC, but SNCC was one of the most important organizations in the civil rights movement that came out of a wave of sit-ins in the 1960s and organized campaigns and other kinds of nonviolent actions to dismantle Jim Crow in the South. And that looked like a whole lot of different things that we don't have time to get into tonight, but they organized the Freedom Rides in the early 60s, which was, this is the picture here on the right is, of people going into the South to expose that even though transit was supposed to be desegregated at that point legally, it was not. They led something called the Albany Movement, which was a desegregation campaign in Albany, Georgia. They led Mississippi Freedom Summer, which was a push to register as many people, Black people, to vote in Mississippi to desegregate the voting system. And so we're involved with lots of different things that were very effective. And they also, as part of that, and as part of their field organizing infrastructure, had a research department. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight, and kind of how that worked, what they did, who they are, because I think there's some lessons for us to take today. Some of these pictures are very blurry, which I apologize for, but they are from kind of archives that aren't of the best quality. But this is a memo that I always think is very funny that says, "At last, the paper you have all been waiting for. What is the SNCC Research Department?" Which is a memo that the SNCC Research Department sent out to field organizers and local offices in 1965 to basically alert them that they existed and explain a little bit what they did and could do. So you can see here in this memo, it says, "Vast quantities of information are stored up in the research department. This report includes a description of the kinds of materials we have on file, our sources of information, and suggestions for improved use of research facilities." And there's a couple of things that are very interesting about this. So they have this like massive data bank with access to lots of different periodicals, newspapers, like industry type publications, as well as labor union publications. They have reference books like Who's Who in America, Who's Who in World Commerce and Industry, Moody's manuals, some things that we still have today, but that are online, Census Bureau publication information, and as well as a bunch of kind of like reference books on the political and economic structures of states in the South. So they have all this information that's sitting in an office, and they have researchers who are able to comb through that information in support of local work. And there's several different ways that SNCC researchers kind of worked with the field and things that they could offer and do. So one was they worked with people that were creating curriculums for freedom schools, like mass political education schools curriculums. They supported SNCC leaders that were doing speaking tours about organizing and ending Jim Crow in the South with facts and figures. They put together like briefs on investigations about racial discrimination by particular companies and businesses. And they also would put together kind of surveys of new geographies where SNCC researchers were going, or SNCC organizers were going into to start to organize, so that they would have kind of like files on their local corporate power structure when they went in. And there's lots of other kind of like particular examples of this that are in SNCC's archive. So this is like a pamphlet that was put together by the head of SNCC's research department called The Care and Feeding of Power Structures, that goes into how to take a particular place and map out what the corporate power structure looks like and the political power structure looks like and the relationship between those things. So at the bottom here, kind of explaining that, is a quote from Julian Bond's book, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, which I feel like speaks to this kind of research really well. I'll just read it real quick, which is, power structure was no abstract phase for SNCC's band of brothers and sisters, but a real list with real people's names and addresses and descriptions of assets and interlocking directorships, demonstrating how large interests ranging from Memphis and New York banks to the Queen of England might own at least partial control of a plantation in Mississippi's Delta. Knowledge of who owned what was crucial to SNCC strategies. From it, we knew that Southern peonage was no accident, but rather the deliberate result of economic policies determined thousands of miles away from the cotton field. And so this kind of like graphic at the top, that's like this mapping out that SNCC researchers could help organizers fill in, is very similar actually to littlesis.org today and some of the mapping that you can do on there. This is an example of when I was talking before that SNCC did freedom schools, so like political education schools. The research department would work with them to help put together materials for the curriculum to make clear kind of who their opposition was in the power structure. This example comes from Mississippi, that was either actively or passively standing in the way of integration, and really understand who they were specifically, where their money comes from, who was local, who was national, and what their kind of like political footprints were. This is another kind of regional example of that. This memo called Who Runs Southwest Georgia. Similarly, that kind of breaks down who's powerful in Southwest Georgia. So this would be an example of SNCC was setting up a new office in a particular geography and wanted to understand both kind of how the community was organized, but also how their opposition was organized. And then there were also like strategic campaigns that SNCC was running that needed research support. So one example, this was SNCC calling for a boycott of Hammermill paper after they set up a new plant in Alabama, after civil rights organizations had called for no new business to be opened in Alabama until segregation opened, or until segregation stopped. And so as part of that, the SNCC research team put together, in response to questions from students actually, who were like, what is Hammermill? Do our colleges do business with them? How do we expand this boycott? Put together like a memo like this that goes into a little bit about what Hammermill is, where they're located, subsidies they get that could be challenged, and contracts they have with universities. A lot of stuff that we'll talk about in our subsequent trainings. The SNCC research department also kind of helped research like alternative political vehicles and political projects. So this is an example here of the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was a SNCC founded independent Black political party. SNCC organizers were interested in doing something like that, but didn't know exactly how. So they went to the research department, who read through a bunch of legal code in Alabama, and were able to figure out that there was kind of like a little bit of a loophole in the law, or an opening in the law, that would allow SNCC to do that. And then they put together this little, essentially a zine, describing how they did that. So that's a little bit about SNCC. The other example that I wanted to talk about is from the anti-war movement. So this is an organization called NARMIC, which came out of the peace movement in the late 1960s, really out of a kind of hunch that the peace movement was very impassioned and very determined, but kind of lacking in hard knowledge about the war machine behind the war. So questions like who was manufacturing and profiting off of bombs and planes and chemicals used in Vietnam? Where were weapons factories, research labs located in the US? What states, what towns, what concentrated geographies, and kind of who are the companies that were fueling and benefiting and profiting from the war. And they kind of thought, if we could understand that in a deeper way, we could run more strategic campaigns, we could put more direct pressure both on weapons companies and on other institutions that were enabling them. And so they started this group called NARMIC. This is a picture of them. They were based in Philadelphia. And they also sent out a memo explaining what they were to the broader kind of peace movement, saying that they wanted to bring action-oriented research and training to the peace movement. So they kind of similarly to SNCC worked closely with organizers. They took direct requests. They trained activists in how to do this research on their own for local campaigns. And they also compiled like a really big data bank, which they talk about here, a big data bank of a bunch of different documents. So reports, again, like newspapers, weapons industry, kind of weeklies and other like industry information. And they had that in their offices in Philadelphia and basically invited that any activists who wanted to access that information could come, could use it, could work with them to find answers to questions they were wondering about. And um, they did a couple of really cool projects. So they worked with campus and university groups to help them map where the military industrial complex showed up on academic campuses. They helped churches and other kind of like responsible investors map out how they were invested in the war and figure out how to use that power as investors to call for an end to the war. They also created, for example, down here, a movement guide to stockholder meetings. So how activists could engage with annual shareholders meetings. We're again going to talk about that in one of our future webinars as well. Creating a guide to researching institutional portfolios. So they both did kind of like, rapid response research around particular local campaigns, but then also created a lot of guides for a whole host of different types of constituencies that were part of the peace movement. So there's a good quote down here about that. Students investigating Pentagon research on campuses, housewives boycotting consumer goods manufactured by war industries, doves for Congress campaign workers, peace organizations of all varieties, professional groups and trade unions have come to NARMIC for facts and to consult on how to best carry out projects. And that's from another kind of like informational pamphlet. And they did a bunch of like data projects that I think today it's like easier to find this information all compiled and nice, but then was not. So they put together an annual list of the biggest defense contractors in the country, for example, drawing on a bunch of the information from their data bank. And then similarly to like that kind of zine type thing that I showed, they really focused on getting their information out broadly and having kind of sophisticated analysis, but having kind of exciting and kind of like pithy ways to share it. So this is from like a slideshow they created that described kind of the basics of what corporations and elected officials and lobbying groups were part of the military industrial complex in the US. And they made a slideshow and then they would have people check the slideshow out, bring it to their communities, do the slideshow as part of organizing against the war. And then, yeah, like I was saying, they also worked with specific groups of people who were interested in targeting war profiteers as part of their organizing. So this are from a series of protests against Honeywell in Minneapolis, which manufactured napalm. And there was this group of people who kind of like knew that Honeywell was part of that, but needed more information. And NARMIC helped them figure out kind of how napalm was developed, who was profiting from it, how it was being used, and opportunities to pressure Honeywell around that, which resulted in these activists over here on the right shutting down Honeywell's annual shareholder meeting. So that's another example kind of from history. And the last one I want to talk about is a more recent example called Genocide Gentry, which is a campaign from several Palestine solidarity organizations that really kind of takes some inspiration from NARMIC and a lot of the projects they worked on, which maps kind of members of the ruling class who are weapons manufacturer leaders or, CEOs or on the board, and specifically their ties to cultural and educational institutions that are allowing them to remain in leadership positions despite their profiting from an ongoing genocide. And this took kind of a fair amount of research to do. If people are interested in this more recent example, you can go to genocidegentry.com. And it looks like this. There are kind of like profiles of different CEOs that have really core roles in kind of enabling the genocide right now that's happening, and then as well as their institutions that they are connected to that are not weapons companies, that are schools, that are foundations, that are museums, that are allowing these people to continue to hold kind of key roles. And there's also like a geographic mapping. So you can kind of see how this comes out of some of that NARMIC work as well. So I think we want to, we'll see if this works. Thank you everyone for being patient with the chat drama, but we wanted people to put some kind of reflection in the chat. So let's try to do it in the Q&A. But if people want to answer kind of one, I just kind of said a lot about 3 different examples. One research tool, source, or method you heard me talk about in these examples. Let's pause and see if people can do that. I actually can't see. Allie, is that working? Or Lauren?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay, cool. So people can throw that in there. Can you call out, Lauren, what people are saying? Because I think I can't see it.
Okay, great. We have some great examples. We have census, geomapping, network analysis, news media, memos and pamphlets, public reports, SNCC resource library. Got a lot of people saying power mapping, network analysis, government records, naming names.
Cool. Yeah, these are all great sources, methods, and tools. And some of which remain the same today, some of which they're kind of more online versions that we're going to talk about. But lots of different great sources or tools. And then if people could name one way the organizations I just talked about used research to strengthen and support their organizing, campaigning, base building, movement building. Put some ideas in there based on what I just said. And Lauren, if people say stuff, if you could.
Yeah. Let's see. Put pressure on Honeywell to stop it making napalm, following the money, training speakers, field workers, and offering archives to local groups, educating community members about possible advocacy steps, exposing lives of corporations, creating transparency. There's so many good things.
Okay, great. Those are all great. And we're going to get into them further. So yeah, I think I'm going to hand it to Lauren, but based on what people just said, I just kind of wanted to highlight kind of like 4 takeaways as people are thinking about how to integrate more research into their organizing. So 1, this is maybe like obvious, but research can play a critical role in supporting and shaping movement strategy and tactics. So we see that in multiple of those examples, the Honeywell example that people were just talking about, figuring out that universities have relationships with boycott targets and the civil rights movement. Lots and lots of examples of that. The other kind of three that are maybe like less obvious things to highlight is that power research is not divided from base building. It educates, emboldens, and draws from the base. So a lot of times we and other people we organize with, members of our organizations, have a lot of knowledge that can be used in the research process. And then that research can also make clearer for people the kind of political moment that we are in, the political analysis that we're all building from one another, and embolden people to take action. Also, kind of the history of movement research shows us how important it is for it to be a collaborative process where research and organizing go hand in hand. That's kind of what we're all about at LittleSis and what this whole series is about. And that also it's really important to have good, detailed research, but that can sometimes be very complicated, but to find ways to communicate it very simply and clearly. So we saw that in the NARMIC example with the slideshows, that like SNCC zine, even like the mapping graphics of local power structures, that it's really important to figure out the right mediums, because we don't just want to hold this information with us as researchers, or even as just, us and the, top leadership of organizations. We want it to be disseminated broadly throughout our movements. So I think as we continue on in this series, those are kind of 4 things we want people to be reflecting on, and thinking about how you can bring that back to where you work. So I think I'm going to throw it to Lauren for what is power research.
All right, so thank you, Molly. Molly just went through both the grounding and then these incredible examples of historical examples and current examples of power research, but we didn't really define that. So we gave some examples. So let's try to come up with like a shared definition for power research, and also talk a little bit about just like what is power, and then we can take what we're learning and work through a mini campaign example together. All right, so next slide, if you don't mind. So power research, we like to have this definition here, that power research is research into the people and organizations with disproportionate wealth and influence, and the relationships between them. So that last part, relationships between them, is really important. Next slide. And we call this, we call, the people and organizations with outsized wealth and influence and the relationships, we call that the power structure. Okay. So to just add a little bit more detail to that. So it's really investigative research. We try to follow the money. We try to connect the dots between these key players in what we call the power structure. And really, these relationships are really key to understanding how power is amassed, how it's wielded, and really importantly, how to pressure, how we can create campaigns that are really strategic, effective, and start to erode at that power structure, corporate power structure. And like a lot of folks put into the Q&A box or the chat box tonight, when we start putting all these pieces together, that's called power mapping. We are creating a map of the relationships of power. Next slide. All right, and all of this connects to this concept of strategy. I really love this definition of strategy. We pulled a lot from this particular book, Practical Radicals. Highly recommend everyone checking it out. It's a wonderful book for anyone new or not so new in movement spaces, to really think about power, to think about research and strategy. And so strategy, as they define, is a plan to achieve a goal under conditions of uncertainty with limited resources and facing opposition. I mean, I think that probably, I would guess, resonates for a lot of us, that we are under conditions of uncertainty right now, often faced with limited resources, facing really intense and strong opposition at this current moment. So how can we think about being strategic, building really strong campaigns? And power research is one way that we can inform strategy. So we'll go to the next slide. Oh, and I should say, they have the book, but they also have a great podcast. So another plug for Practical Radicals. It's great. All right, so we've talked a little bit about examples of power research. We've gotten a definition of power research, but here's this huge question. What is power? If everyone could kind of put their definition of power, and there's many, into the Q&A box, we can read a few off. Okay, a lot of love for the podcast. Love that. All right, so power is decision-making influence, ability to influence. We're seeing a lot of, okay, that ability to control. Power is, in this society, money. Ability to make something happen or stop something from happening. Translate ideas into real life. Scrolling through this. Ability to change conditions, all of this. Okay, great. These are really great definitions of power. Next slide. One definition that we really like that encompasses a lot of this is the ability to make the world how you want it to be, even against opposition. So I want to stress that often when we think of power, I think justifiably so, we think of oppressive power. We think of the power that our opponents hold, but we also hold power collectively. And we, like I think many people on this call, are working to build power to resist some of the systems of violence and oppression that we see, and build really strong campaigns. So our opponents hold power, we can hold power, we can wield power as well. So let's step into this a little bit. Also in Practical Radicals, they provide this framework for thinking about power. They provide 6 different types of power that our opponents, or as they call the overdogs, hold, and also types of power that we can build in our movements as well. So starting with solidarity power, next slide. They define this as the power to work together, ability to form networks, associations that advance one's interests. And, we can think of this as unions, our campaigns, our mutual aid work, but also in how our opponents are building nationalist movements this current moment especially in the US here. Next. All right, type 2, so disruptive power, defined as non-cooperation with the status quo, so the ability to disrupt business as usual. And, we can wield this type of disruptive power through strikes and blockades, direct action, but also, our opponents often wield this. One example is using police to infiltrate movements. Next. Economic power, defined as the ability to control the production of goods and services, how those goods and services are allocated, who has access to it, who has the ability to accumulate wealth. And, no surprise, like the financial elite, our bosses, really hold and wield this type of power, but we can also wield this type of power through withholding our labor through strikes, or, engaging in boycotts, for example. And then ideological power. I think this one is a type that I think is less obvious, but extremely important. So the ability to set right and wrong, to set values about our beliefs, our norms, how we make sense of the world. And, a lot of the ideological power is held by like big institutions. So faith-based organizations, news, media outlets, our academic institutions, our workplaces, think tanks, and, various parts of our culture. So yes, ideological power, big one. All right, political power, and we have one more after this. Political power is defined here as the ability to really set rules, to reward and punish, and we in our mass movements can really try to build up political power and trying to put allies in public office. We also contend with political power. Our opponents wield this type of power through police, legal systems, court systems, etc. And then finally, military power, which the authors define as the ability to use or threaten, especially large-scale violence. So war making, perpetuating genocide, suppressing resistance efforts, etc. Okay, so we've defined power research, we've defined power. We have kind of stepped through a framework of different types of power that are opponents and that we can also wield and use and contest. So how can we do research and how can we use it? So right now we're kind of going to give like a high level overview. Definitely tune in to some of the subsequent trainings. We'll get into the nitty gritty. We'll provide really practical tools, but let's talk a little bit more broadly. All right, so when we're in a campaign, for example, what are some questions that we ask? What is the information that we are looking for to kind of inform our strategy, inform our campaign? Here are a couple questions. What are our opponents' priorities? What are they interested in? What arguments do they respond to? Importantly, what relationships do they hold? So what organizations are they connected to? And this could be, you know, are they on the boards of local nonprofits? Do they belong to professional associations in your town? What's their professional history? Where have they worked? What does their philanthropic giving look like? Are they connected to any charities, for example? Do you happen to know staff at any of those organizations and could talk to? What additional people are your opponents connected to? That could be faith-based organizations, what events they typically attend, and what politicians they're close with. One way to look up the relationships to politicians is who they're donating to, which is often provided through local and state databases. And also looking into their business operations. So how did they amass their wealth? Looking through some of their investments. Who are some of their investors? Do they hold property? Yeah, where are they giving donations? And then really importantly too is, are there any sort of contradictions that we can really lift up as we're doing this research as part of our public pressure campaigns, for example? This is, you know, this is an example that came up a lot where I am in Philly. Is a wealthy but negligent landlord stating that they can't afford repairs? Did they just buy a seaside mansion for $5 million? That might be a contradiction. All right. So how can we, once we start thinking through these research questions, we start learning some tools to compile this information. So how can we use this, you know, Molly talked through a bunch of examples that really kind of get at this, but just to reiterate, is once we have this information, we can get a better understanding of what we're, you know, who we're up against and the issues that we're facing. We can start really formulating super clear demands based on this information that we know. We can start identifying who are the big decision makers. So if we have demands, who can actually move on those demands? And who do we need to either be allied with, or who do we need to pressure to make those demands happen? So our targets, our opposition, our allies. We've talked a lot about how research can really inform the strategies that we employ in our campaigns and what tactics and actions we develop, and also just building a bigger narrative about about the issue that we're grappling with. We can also find points of leverage. So, for opposition, who are their supporters? Who are their pillars of support that we can start to pressure and start to weaken? How can we drive a wedge between parts of this power structure? Like, for example, if there's a proposed fossil fuel project in your community happening, how can you make that project so publicly toxic that investors start to pull out, that insurance companies start to pull out, that government officials no longer have faith in that project, etc. So how do you find those points of leverage and drive a wedge? Research can also help you find common allies that are also up against a similar opponent. And then finally, We love to underscore that research can be a great way to organize people. We hold research parties, a researchathon, which is great for bringing in new people into a campaign or movement spaces, and really, equipping people with new skills and confidence to really be leaders in movement spaces. All right, so we're going to pause really quickly before moving on to a little campaign scenario to start bringing some of these pieces together. Are there any quick questions that we can answer on any of what we've brought up before we move on?
And if folks have other questions, you can put it in the Q&A. There is one about, what to do when a corporation, like a landlord, is blatantly breaking the law, but no one in power seems to care. It's a longer question than that, but maybe we can talk about that really quick.
Yeah, that's a hard one. And Molly, I'm curious if you have a response too. It's unfortunately so common. And I think that's where getting a very clear sense of how you can build a really broad public pressure campaign to just bring the public in on what's happening, to start to pressure local officials to actually care. And if they don't care, then their reputation is at stake. Trying to build a big movement to actually have that happen, I think, is really important. I don't know if you want to say anything too.
Yeah, I think we'll talk more about this in future trainings as well, but I think you're that question is like a little bit getting at what can be frustrating and kind of paradoxical about research sometimes, which is that we want information, and also information doesn't change power. And so part of what kind of doing this kind of research is figuring out how do we actually change power? What do our opponents care about? So if that landlord, if just the landlord breaking the law is not going to be enough, and just kind of exposing that in most situations or a lot of situations is not going to be enough to stop it. But if we can understand what that landlord relies on, what kind of investors, what political relationships, what's important to them personally and socially, and figure out a way, like Lauren said, to kind of build pressure campaigns around that, and figure out what all of those different actors care about, and if there are ways to make them care about, or to make it harder to not care about what we're saying than it is for them to care about it, then that starts to shift power and gets powerful actors to change their behaviors. So I think, yeah, what you're getting to is really at the heart of, kind of the world that we live in, and what a lot of this research is about. But yeah, we're going to share more kind of about how to go about that in future webinars. And it's a very rich topic.
Yeah, I see a couple folks also asking about researchathons. Some just quick information about that is that it's really, I feel like it's been really effective to take a very straightforward research project. Like maybe you go through political donations and categorize them according to like industry. And so maybe that is a researchathon. So usually it's like maybe something that is a lot of work that would really benefit from having 20 people over 2 hours work on it, but it's fairly straightforward research, and that you all can kind of do in the same room or on Zoom. And something that like I think a lot of people can kind of get plugged in very quickly too. I think that's what has worked for past researchathons in my experience. I would say, yeah, I would encourage everyone, after listening to some of the trainings that we're doing over the next couple months, start your own researchathon. You'll have the tools to do that. I don't know, Molly, if you want to say anything else too about researchathons. Bring snacks. I think that's the huge thing. Please bring snacks.
And we're down to help people kind of figure out agendas for research-a-thons, provide support for that. We can share examples how we've planned them in the past.
Yeah. Cool. And I also see some questions about, okay, so what are the like concrete tools? We're going to provide a few at the end of tonight's session, and then the next 3 trainings are going to go deeply into that. So stay tuned. All right. Okay, so we're going to try a campaign scenario together. There's 266 of us on this call tonight, so bear with us. We're trying this out. But okay, so here's the scenario to try to make concrete some of the terms and concepts that we're introducing tonight. Imagine, I think for a lot of us, we don't have to imagine that we're a tenant, but imagine you are a tenant trying to form a union with other tenants in your building. You and other tenants have dealt with a neglectful landlord. You've experienced lack of heat, some plumbing issues, mold, pests. And despite repeated requests, your landlord has not made these fixes. So it's come to the point of trying to organize with other tenants in your building to get some of these repairs made. You want to start a campaign to really pressure your landlord to actually make some of these repairs. And you want to know, are there tenants in other buildings that the landlord owns that you can organize with to really make this a bigger campaign? So let's put our like researcher hats on. What is some research that we could do that could help us in our efforts to try to work with other tenants and pressure our landlord to make repairs? I will start with a couple questions just to get us going. I think it's really important for us to know actually who is our landlord. So many of us actually just know our landlord as a corporation, maybe a faceless LLC or a property management group. So who is the actual human or humans who own our building and could make the changes that we need? That's one research question we could kind of start with. Another research question in there is, okay, does our landlord own other properties? And where are those properties? Can we connect with those tenants? So yeah, if we could copy the Google Doc link into the chat, if everyone could go to the first slide and grab one sticky note, and if you're able to like copy a sticky note, that's great since there's 250 of us. Put like one additional idea, like what's some additional information that might be helpful in this type of campaign? We'll give everyone maybe like 2 minutes. Oh, okay. The link doesn't work in the chat. Okay. Let's see if we can, I'm going to try to make a bit.ly very quickly. If we can do that.
Can people access the link in the chat now?
Okay, I think maybe we will try to skip this Google slide, Google Whiteboard, and let's put some ideas in the Q&A box. The old faithful Q&A box. Let's give it one more minute. Okay. Great. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of really incredible ideas here. Let me scroll. All right, so we're seeing research property tax records, seeing if they own any other businesses, some of their like social connections with civic organizations, campaign contributions. Okay, so like what politicians they may know, right? And maybe then you can approach some of those politicians to say, hey, like your bud, the landlord, let's get some repairs going. Yeah, looking into the history of, have they had past grievances? Like, have they had citations? Have they had past evictions? Look into some of the local landlord tenant laws. Survey some of the tenants. Yep. Okay. And yeah, get to know some of the neighbors, get to know other tenants in your building and in your community to really build that campaign out. Look into other violations. Okay, this is so great. Yep. Okay, awesome. So yeah, I think all of these are really great research avenues to pursue. I have like a little recap on the next slide that we can go through. So often our landlord operates in a shell corporation like an LLC. So starting to look through some of the local and state databases to understand ownership and see like what LLCs are and properties are connected to that landlord. That's great. We heard from folks in the chat box say, you know, affiliations to local nonprofits. You know, is this landlord connected in some way to universities? Do you know people at these universities too? Are they part of business industry groups? We heard folks say connections to politicians and also information on past lawsuits or controversies. Often looking through your local newspaper can be a really great source for that. I would also say look at some of the quote unquote like good press. Like in the example I gave before, did they publicize that they bought a very luxurious mansion? And then, yeah, looking through some of their history of citations of violations, unpaid taxes, evictions, for example, and getting a better handle about their business model and operations. So often, like here in Philly, there is some information about the banks offering mortgages to property owners. You could try to look through any sort of published information about the investors. Is this landlord buying new buildings? Did they just acquire new buildings? And also, are they receiving any sort of like public subsidies too, or even like some tax breaks? So all of that can be like helpful information to support the campaign. All of that can be considered power research. All right. Cool. Let's do one more chat box jubilee. And if you can drop into the Q&A. So we've talked through what type of information might be helpful. I'm guessing there's a lot of wisdom here of folks on the call on where can we actually find some of this information. Okay, in New York City, there's a website called Who Owns What. I love that website. Yep. What are some like sources of this information? Social media, you can also find social affiliations that way. That's great. Cities keep public property records. That's great. Lawsuits can often be found online. Yep. Public libraries. I love that. Yes. Can go to your public library and often access databases that allow you to gain additional information about corporations. Yep. All right, struggling to keep up with this. Let's see. SEC filings, absolutely. We'll talk about that in later training. Okay, great. These are excellent sources. All right, I'm going to pass it to Molly to step through some additional sources and close out.
Cool. Thanks, Lauren. So as we keep saying, the next 3 trainings are really going to focus on digging in deep to some of the sources that you guys were just talking about, and kind of like what we think of as being kind of like go-to databases and other sources of information for doing this kind of research. But because you all got on tonight, we wanted to make sure to have something in the slide deck, which we will share, that kind of starts to point to some of those tools and what is available where. So this is kind of like a really great little cheat sheet that Lauren made. The left column is like what information you're trying to find, and then the right column is where you might be able to find it. So a couple of things to just highlight. I mean, Google, we'll talk about Google a little bit in our next training. It's a very powerful tool. The official websites of corporations are also places where you can often find information on leadership, other affiliations. LinkedIn, so people are saying social media, also kind of a go-to. The SEC's Edgar database is where most public corporations have to file public financial disclosures. And there's also a couple of helpful websites like Whale Wisdom that help track investors in big publicly traded corporations. We're going to go into those in a lot of detail in next month's training. ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer lets you search Form 990s, which are the forms that nonprofits, including universities, including corporate trade groups, charitable foundations, individual foundations, have to file IRS forms. And that is a great site that lets you search those. And on the nonprofits training, we'll go through those in detail. And then there's also a lot of great sources for investigating lobbying and campaign finance. Both like each state usually has their own. There's also opensecrets.org, which lets you search kind of like all the data all together. And then the last thing is for violations and lawsuits. The group Good Jobs First has a really awesome tracker, violationtracker.goodjobsfirst.org, that again lets you search multi-states, kind of it like pulls together data from a bunch of different sources into one place. So these are kind of like sneak preview of tools we're going to go into much deeper, but if you're like really rearing to go tonight and want to explore some of those, we definitely encourage that. And then this is kind of similar information, just displayed in a little bit of a different way that people can take a look at after tonight when you go through the slides. So this is kind of information that you often want to find about a public company and where to find it, kind of their network of ties. This one is for a nonprofit. Some of that stuff I was just talking about is here, but information you might want to find and where to go. And then this one is for a person. So any kind of powerful person, a CEO, a billionaire, an elected official, a handful of things you might want to find and where to find it. So those are kind of like cheat sheets before we get into stuff. I think that let's in the spirit of that and thinking about kind of what's next for you and kind of how to take what we learned tonight back to where you are organizing. We'd love for people to share again in the Q&A. What's one way you can take something you learned tonight back to your organizing or to your community? And Lauren, maybe you can shout them out for me because it's not letting me look at it while I'm screen sharing. Thank you.
We're all helping each other out tonight.
Very collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
What's one way you can take something you learned tonight into your community or organizing?
All right, compiling databases, having all colleagues watch this video, researchathon. Let's see. Oh, it's chat box. Okay, gonna make more zines. I hope to make more zines too. Let's see what else. Different ways to research and map.
Cool. Maybe one more.
Well, snacks definitely mentioned again. Okay, that's good. This chat box is scrolling chaotically. Yeah, maybe we can end there because it's now scrolling beyond my comprehension.
All right, we can keep putting stuff in there. And like I said, we're down at LittleSis to help support any of those efforts. We also have some additional kind of tools that people can use in doing that. So if you go to mapthepower.net, we have a toolkit for doing power research. It's organized by how to research people and how to research organizations, corporations, or other groups. So there's also kind of helpful exercises you can do, information on tools you can use that goes a little bit more in depth to what we talked tonight, and that can be kind of used alongside this training series. We're gonna start to wrap up soon, but we wanted to do one more poll if people would indulge us in that to get a little bit of feedback on tonight's webinar and kind of a sense of what you learned tonight. So Allie, if you could launch that. Awesome. And if people could answer these couple of questions for us, that would be great. I'll give people like 3 minutes. And then I'll share a little bit more about how you can access all of the great resources that we have for you. I'm gonna give people like another minute. All right, 20 more seconds. So if you're finishing up, go ahead and submit. All right, cool. And Allie, if we could end it, that would be great. Thank you all. All right, so this was our first training of the series. Next month, on June 18th, we're going to get together and dig into researching the corporation. We're going to talk about how to find strategic information in public filings, things like profits, executive pay, major shareholders, and get into how to use that information in campaigning. So getting at that question that someone was asking earlier about like, how do you actually use the information to change power dynamics? So we hope that you all join us for that. We will send an email that has a recording link. You can also scan this QR code right now to get the slides from tonight, but we'll send those around as well. So I'll give people a second if you want to hold your phone up to the screen and scan that, you'll have the slides. But if you signed up for tonight's webinar, should be all good and you will get a recording. All right, take your pictures. Cool. And the last thing is, obviously this training was free. We love to do them for free. But if you want to help support our work, we would very much appreciate it. You can go to littlesis.org/donate. And if you become a sustainer, which is donating $15 a month. In the next 24 hours, you get a LittleSis hoodie, which is, I think this is Lauren's dog maybe, or maybe our coworker Rob's dog modeling it here. Yeah, so if you do that in the next 24 hours, you'll get a wonderful hoodie and our gratitude for supporting this work. I think that is all for tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us. And thanks for hanging in there with us in the Q&A. Yeah, we hope it was helpful, and we hope to see you next month when we really get into the nitty gritty and the weeds. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Lauren and Allie for helping. Cool. And we will see you all soon.